So this is my spoken word set. I'm going to go fast, and I wrote it all down because I got a lot to say. My name is Kevin Sutton. I go by he, him, or they, them. I was born first-generation Canadian citizen settler and descendant of the African slave trade and subsequent diaspora. I am black with light skin that was raped into my Caribbean ancestors by plantation owners. I am invisibly disabled and high risk. I am non-binary but male-presenting. My sexuality is complicated, but I am straight passing. I am a recovering capitalist, having lived across multiple classes from affluence to poverty. I am 50 years old, but passed for younger. I am a single parent of a wonderful 7-year-old child. I tell you all these things to position myself within the overlapping systems and structures of institutionalized oppression. Because when we talk about race, there are also overlapping systems that include sexism, ableism, trans, and homophobia, and many, many more. When a person experiences multiple overlapping marginalizations, they don't act as multipliers, they act as exponents. We exist at these intersections of systems of oppression, and even within race, different races and ethnic origins experience racism differently. Anti-Black racism is known to be one of the most pernicious forms. However, in Canada, we would be remiss if we did not acknowledge that our Indigenous siblings experience the brunt of Canadian structural oppression by our country's design. Let me repeat that. Racism is embedded in our society, socially and structurally, through the entirety of our history by design. On June 18, 1452, the papal bull of Pope Nicholas V, somewhat appropriately named Dum Diversus, gave Afonso V of Portugal permission to conquer the Saracens and pagans and consign them to perpetual servitude. This was extended to the Americas on May 4th, 1493 by Pope Alexander VI. Why the history lesson? Well, this is considered to be the beginning of the grand colonial exercise, initiated by the European ideals of imperialism that gave way to the transatlantic African slave trade and the genocide of indigenous peoples across the Americas, which includes what is now considered Canada. Most Canadians are surprised to learn that we actually had 200 years of slavery in Canada. The TLDR is that Christian European imperialism extracted wealth from the Americas and Africa through slavery, genocide, and land theft, which became the founding principles of what we now call capitalism, which continues to rely on the extraction of wealth through the exploitation of land and human bodies. Think about this the next time you contribute to the bloating fortune of billionaires like Jeff Bezos of Amazon. As the nations of the Americas established themselves through slavery, genocide, and theft, they developed their infrastructure to maintain control of what had now become assets. Indigenous peoples were systematically removed from their land. The RCMP was in fact founded to enable the process of settlers moving west in this manner. Africans were imported as slave labor. Police forces were founded from slave catchers and union busters. Every single founding structure in the Americas, which included Canada, was created to facilitate this economic enterprise. Although there have been interventions in this process, notably the end of slavery, patriation of the Canadian Constitution, and the founding of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, these structures themselves have remained fundamentally unchanged to this day. The Indian Act is still on the books. This is the soil of modern racism, and we all spring from it. And because of the nature of socialization, none of us are exempt from it. It is embedded in our economic system, our justice system, our healthcare system, education, housing, food, labor, politics, governance, every single social structure, and thus inherently socialized into absolutely every single one of us. For over 500 years, the bedrock of society has been the Christian European supremacy that we now call whiteness, which we can see as fundamentally anti-Black and anti-Indigenous. In fact, those might be understatements. It's also robbed people who fall under whiteness of their own indigeneity that may go back to Irish, Polish ancestors. So what's changed in 500 years? Well, 55 years ago, we experienced mass protests that led to civil rights era, which, while it didn't end systemic white supremacy, it changed the conversation. Racism became considered a moral failing and therefore individual, conscious, and intentional, what I call bad apple theory. This allowed white people to exempt themselves from complicity in the fundamental systems of oppression that still extracted wealth from Black and brown bodies and stolen land, while still benefiting from the spoils. So rather than solving racism, the civil rights era actually ushered in an age where it became inappropriate to talk about a system that was completely unchanged. Slavery turned into sharecropping, turned into the school to private prison pipeline. Police murders of Black population occur at a greater rate than lynchings during Jim Crow. Segregation still occurs through white flight from bad neighborhoods, statistically defined as anything over 20% Black. We can see that bad apple theory is a false narrative intended to obscure and preserve systems of oppression that benefit whiteness and harm Black and Indigenous communities by design. Whiteness remains the normalized atmosphere of dominance that Black and Indigenous people can't breathe. So yes, you are racist, in that you are complicit in a system of white supremacy that benefits you and harms Black communities. It's not a matter of your moral character. It's a fundamental systemic function of society in which you are embedded. So what can we do to address this? We must first admit that this will be a process that extends over several generations to come, and that all of us are recovering from this and have to heal together. We have to admit